Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm John Paris. I am the chair of the College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee. And on behalf of all of us involved here today, I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar. This is the part 3 of a 3-part webinar series entitled Native Voices. Tonight's presentation is called Indigenous Boarding and Residential Schools and the Pursuit of Truth and Reconciliation. We at the College of DuPage and the Native American Studies Committee of College of DuPage have partnered with a number of groups to present tonight. So I would like to thank all those involved, including the 10 Chicagoland area public library districts that are joining us tonight, and the College of DuPage Speakers Bureau, and of course, oh my goodness, I almost forgot who's oh, of course, yes. And then the Native Justice Coalition, the NCTR of Canada, and the National Boarding School Healing Coalition. So thank you all for joining us tonight. So without any further ado, let me introduce our panelists for tonight. We have, coming from the National Commission of Truth and Reconciliation of Canada, Kayla Johnston. Kayla Johnston is the supervisor of the Education, Outreach, and Public Programming Office of the Canadian NCTR. She is a member of the Cree Nation and oversees matters related to the support of educators, development of resources, establishment of outreach initiatives, and public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Joining us from the Native Justice Coalition, we have Cecilia Lapointe. They are the founder and executive director of the Native Justice Coalition. They're also a founder and owner of the Red Circle Consulting and Wab-Ajajak Press, a Great Lakes Anishinaabe publisher, and a devoted Ojibwe leader, activist, and poet. And to round out the 3 panelists, we also have Deirdre Whiteman, who is the Director of Research and Education for the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She is Meskwaki, Dakota, Ojibwe, Hidatsa, and an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and has been a pioneering and dedicated educator to Native communities in Minneapolis for decades. So welcome, a very warm welcome to all of our presenters. Before we continue, I wanted to just go over a few quick community guidelines, and you can read most of this obviously yourself, but I just would like to emphasize a couple key points. Please communicate with courtesy and respect. I think everything else stems from that. And also, speak from the heart, listen from the heart, and challenge yourself to listen to others. We also wanted to mention that this will be videotaped, so please submit any questions into the question and answer box. Our panelists at the question and answer session at the latter half hour of this 90-minute presentation will take questions at the end of the discussion. I will be the moderator, so I will see some questions and I will funnel them to the presenters. If there are quite a few questions, there's obviously, because of time, there will only be room for some of the questions, not all. So no disrespect is intended if your question isn't addressed, but I will do my best to get as many questions to our panelists in the time we have set aside for that. Again, this presentation is being recorded, just so you're all aware, and it will be archived for future viewing. It will be posted. Usually it takes a few days to a week at the very most to appear on the College of DuPage YouTube channel. A link will be emailed to registered attendees as well, so you can see that for future reference. So before we begin, one other matter I would like to address, and that is the College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee Land Acknowledgement Statement. We, the College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee, acknowledge that the campus and district that we occupy currently exists on the traditional lands of numerous nations, including the Anishinaabe, which is the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, the Haudenosaunee, the Ho-Chunk, the Illiniwek, Kickapoo, Menominee, Miami, and Meskwaki peoples. We recognize that we are the most recent residents of lands that have a long history, defined by numerous custodians who occupied, cultivated, honored, and protected the land for over 10,000 years, that land was stolen and its inhabitants unjustly removed, and who presently live and proudly preserve their culture and identity in this area and elsewhere. We acknowledge and honor with respect and gratitude the land itself, its history, and the peoples who have stewarded it through the generations. We are the College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee. We promote Native American peoples, cultures, and history by fostering education and providing a forum where Native Americans and their allies can share experience and learn about Native culture, history, and identity with the College of DuPage community. Membership in our committee is open to all College of DuPage students, staff, and community members. And to learn more or to join our committee, either go to our Facebook page, College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee, or you can contact myself, John Paris, at parisj@cod.edu. So thank you all again for attending. And now I will turn things over to the first of our three presenters, and that would be Deirdre Whiteman. So Ms. Whiteman, thank you.
Madakiapi, chante washte nape chuzapi, deishkia wachiankapi kdeye, Deidre Whiteman and makiapi, mini wakan, oyate hemata haye, wana Vermilion, South Dakota, Edwati. I said, hello, my relatives. I greet you all with a good, heartfelt handshake. My name is Deidre Whiteman, and I come from the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation, located in Fort Totten, North Dakota. I'm also Meskwaki, Hidatsa, and Ojibwe. And I always like to share all of my my tribes because all four of my grandparents were attended boarding schools, and so in that way I try to just always remember them because they're always with me and they're always a part of me, and so that's the reason why I like to share all of my tribes. And sometimes people ask, you know, like, wow, you're a lot of nations, but you know, a lot of our tribal people are. We come from a lot of different backgrounds. So, okay. So like John said, I am from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and our main offices are located in the Twin Cities. And I have been with NABS. NABS is the acronym we call our coalition for short. And I've been with them for about 5 months now. So I'm still new in my role and I'm still learning a lot. I do have a lot of lived experience, especially in my family with boarding schools, as a lot of Native people do. And sometimes they don't know. And part of our mission at NABS is to seek truth, justice, and healing. And that kind of explains, you know, as I go throughout the presentation, you'll see that through the presentation on how, you know, we're leading this movement, or are part of this movement, I should say, to uncover the truth, get justice, and bring healing to our communities. And so this is just, I wanted to share our mission and our vision with all of you. Our main mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. And so that's what our goal is at NABS. And as we go forward in this presentation, some of this may be heavy for some of you, and some of it may be something that you've never heard of. And so I always like to start out with every presentation just giving everyone a good understanding of what I'm going to talk about, and so that you're not triggered, or you're not feeling or you may be feeling overwhelmed by the information. So I just want to give like a warning to all of you, just so that you know that what we're going to talk about is can be very emotionally charged and triggering. And so if you have a glass of water near you, I encourage you to drink water. And I encourage you just to really take care of yourself. And if you have to walk away from the screen, I understand completely. I can't see any of you, so I'm usually in front of people during my presentation. So maybe this way might be a little bit better. So if you have to walk away, I understand. But this is being recorded. So if you need to come back, feel free. Okay, so the first thing I want to start out with is some people ask me the question of, well, what are boarding schools? How did this happen? And so I always like to lead with a timeline of U.S. Indian policy, because this is really the root of everything. This is the start and the beginning of how we came to be to this day as Native people. And I really want to point out that I wish I could see all of you, because I like to ask a lot of questions, but as all of you know, what happened in 1492? Well, Columbus got lost, and he was discovered by the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands. And so he got lost during that time. And then the following year, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issues the Inter Cetera Papal Bull, also known as the Doctrine of Discovery, which lays the foundation of what happened in the Americas. And it's still happening to this day. And so this is the first of many policies that were created, many doctrines that were created, laws that were created to basically commit cultural genocide in the Americas, or just genocide, plain and simple. And I really want to, like I said, start with this, because this really sets the tone and the foundation of how we got to where we are today. And so as you can see, and you might not be able to see it too, I'm sorry, I can't blow this up any further, but I wanted to point out just a few of these dates on this timeline. So if we look at 1646, John Eliot, who was I believe he was a preacher, he conducted his first sermon at for an Indian audience, which laid the foundation for missionary programs in New England that sought to civilize Indians by isolating them from praying, by isolating them in praying towns. Also at this time, well, not 1646, but starting in 1650s, the Harvard Indian School began. And this was an agreement between the English settlers and the tribal people of that area to start schooling the Indian students there. And then I also like to go into looking at, well, kind of fast forward to 1819, which was the Indian Civilization Fund Act, which authorizes up to $10,000 a year to support the efforts of religious groups and interested individuals willing to live among and teach Indians. Civilizing meant stripping traditions and customs from Native peoples and transferring them into Christian farmers or laborers. So this is the beginning, and this is also where we see a lot of mission and day schools begin around in Native settlements, Native territories. This is where we see a lot of the establishment of those mission and day schools. And so then as we go further, as we move up in 1868, we have what's called the President Grant's peace policy, which gives the Bureau of Indian Affairs Christian and gives Christian denominations power over Indian programs on reservations, leading the way to Indian boarding schools. And so as you notice, I jumped over a few of these policies. They all relate to boarding schools. I just wanted to kind of give you, we only have 20 minutes and this is, we're talking over 500 years. I'm condensing into 20 minutes. So forgive me for skipping over some of this stuff. So then we have the establishment of the first Indian boarding school, which was in 1879, which was led by General Colonel Pratt. And he opened that in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. At this time, over 10,000 children from tribes all over the United States and Alaskan Territory are sent to the first federal off-reservation Indian boarding schools. So in 1879, This is where we start to see children being forcibly removed from their communities, from their homes. Before then, like I said, it was just mission and day schools where the federal government would hear back from the Commission of Indian Affairs and they were deemed as not being successful. So in comes General Pratt in 1879, and he wanted to establish these schools because that he felt that students would do better away from their families. And we'll talk more as we go through about that. So I like to show this video, this graphic of how, you know, these federal policies affected Native communities even to this day. And so we have, you know, again, like I mentioned, 1492, we have the initial, when Columbus was lost at sea and was found by the Indigenous people. And then we move into the invasion and removal starting in the 1600s, and then all the way to self-determination where we're at this present day. And as you can see in 2020, what we're left with. And I also like to show this as a way to teach others that as Native people, we are very much tied to this land. And like I mentioned before, I'm 4 different tribes, and each, even though they're very different, they're very similar in that we all have a creation story that's tied to this land. So we as Indigenous people strongly, you know, we're connected to this land. This land is who we are, and there's no separation of that. And so, you know, to be reduced from this vast amount of land to what we are now, kind of gives you a context and an understanding of, you know, how we ended up to where we're at now. So like I mentioned before, Indian boarding schools began in the 1800s. Right now, with the research that we've been doing at NABS, we found over 497 US Indian boarding schools. This is different from what the Department of Interior has released. And so we are still conducting research. This is an ongoing process, but this is what really begins what we call assimilation and genocide in the United States. And so, sorry, I have to look at two different screens because my thing isn't working very well. But I like to show this picture just to give you a good understanding of the students, or I don't know why I say students, but the children that were coming in, because this wasn't really, when you think of schools, you think of it's a place, you know, of love and laughter and learning. These schools were not that. These schools were a way to erase children's identity, take them away from their families, and commit genocide. And so this picture clearly shows, you know, these children coming in. In the top picture, you can see them coming in, you know, in their clothing, in their attire, and in the way their hair is laid. And then on the bottom, you see them, you know, when they're being moved through the boarding schools and how they look. And so children were placed in dormitory settings, fashioned after military model, which isolated them in regimented and sterile settings, separated from their homes and communities. They were intentionally and systematically inculcated with shame for being who they are through ridicule of their religions and their life ways. Shame that became internalized as self-loathing and emotional disenfranchisement for their own culture. Children were bullied and assaulted by the adults, as well by older children, under the modeling and instructioning of staff. They observed and suffered physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse. So systematic institutional neglect and fear of death from persistent moralities motivated many students to run away. So like I mentioned before, Carlisle Indian School was one of the first boarding schools established by Colonel Pratt. And from 1883 to 1918, there were 1,842 desertion. So children would leave these places because of the abuses that I mentioned before. They wanted to return home. They wanted to be with their families. They didn't want to be subjugated to these kind of conditions because it was something that they never experienced before. And it's very, very traumatic. Sometimes it's really hard to talk. If I sound like a robot, it's because I'm trying to push myself through this, because some of this can be really hard to talk about. So I'm just trying to push myself through this because it can be really emotional as I begin to talk about more of the things that happened to these children. So if they were captured, they were sent back to the school and punished by physical restraints, beatings, and isolations in unlighted cellars, unlighted and unventilated outbuildings designed as jails. And between 1879 and 1918, Carlisle reported 293 deaths. So this is the only number we have that they've reported. We don't know if there were more numbers. We're still researching all this information. But we do know that over 1,100 were sent home because they were too sick to remain, and they more than likely died at home or on the way. And we're still compiling that research as well, because we do hear a lot of stories. And when we take stories from survivors or their descendants, they do mention that they went. Their great grandparent went to Carlisle, but when they got home, they passed away because they were too sick. So we're still compiling these numbers. So just a comparison of Carlisle student deaths to national averages reflect that in 1880, the United States death rate was 15.09 per 1,000. At Carlisle, it was 67.86 per 1,000. And in 1890, the United States rate was 14 per 1,000. And at Carlisle, it was 49.26 per 1,000. So this kind of gives you an overall view of what was happening at Carlisle and what the children were being subjugated to. I mean, when you think of schools, you think of, again, like I mentioned, they're going to learn, but this wasn't a place of learning. And so trauma from these boarding school experiences, and like I said, I've just covered one school, just one brief explanation of what happened. This doesn't stand alone in isolation. There's a long history of successive traumas from the very first contact with Western Europeans, including losses from diseases. It's estimated that up to 90% of the population had little to no resistance to the diseases that came over from Europe. The repeated breaches of treaties and agreements with European nations and later the United States, every treaty was violated, leading to wars and massacres such as Sand Creek and Wounded Knee. Also the Trail of Tears, forced marches to lands far from the traditional homelands, followed by yet more takings of the land and set aside for their settlement and survival. Like I mentioned it before, Indigenous people were tied to our land. We come from this land, and this is where our creation starts. So this is it's like imagine being away from your mother, your father, and that's how we view our land, and then being taken from you. And this is just part of one of the traumatic experience Indigenous people faced around this time. And then being reduced to reservations, cut off from traditional sources of food, trade, and religious and cultural sites and resources. Again, all of these things, the land sustained us, and then to be forced onto reservations that were very foreign to us. It caused all this compounded trauma. we still feel today. And I know I'm getting close to my time, but I just wanted to leave you with this picture. To me, this is one of the most powerful pictures that I'd love to share with you, because you can see that, just depending on the way you look at it, but the way I like to look at it is from left to right. You see our ancestors, and you see our relatives, and then as you move to the right, you begin to see smiling, because we're resilient people, and we want to be happy, and we want to live, and we want to have our children happy, and because this land is who we are, and even though these things are hard to talk about, we need to talk about them, because in our communities there's so much beauty, but there's also so much pain, and if we don't talk about these things, how can we move forward in a healthy way? And so I really find this picture powerful, because it really speaks to me, and it speaks to what we've endured as tribal people, and as our Canadian relatives who are going to come on and speak after me. They'll talk more about the healing that we're doing, but in my organization, we do focus on healing in our communities, and that's part of our mission. And so I just encourage all of you who is on this webinar, that if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, you can find us on all of these social media sources, and also on our website. Again, this is a lot of work, and I try my best to compound 500 years into 20 minutes. So if you want more information, please feel free to go to our website. We're also doing it's called 7 Weeks of Action, and we are trying to get legislation passed in Congress to pass a bill that will support our work, and then support our healings in our communities, and then also seek truth from these churches that haven't shared their records. So what we want to do is be able to have subpoena power to get access to these records, so that we can begin to tell our stories, begin to share with our communities, because only by doing this that we can move forward and begin to heal in our communities. And so we just feel like this is really important. And so if you want more information, please go to our website, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after the following presenters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deidre, for everything. And we will now move to talk to Cecilia Lapointe, who is from the Native Justice Coalition. Cecilia?
Yes, good evening, everyone. I actually do not have a presentation. I usually love to do presentations, but it's actually great that Deirdre went before me to kind of talk about things that we're working on. And actually, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is one of our partners. So it's great. I'm going to share a little bit more of the community-based work, and just like the lived experience as well. And just FYI, I'm only sharing from my personal experience, and I do reflect on my family, relatives, and greater community, but just respect everyone's story and their lived experience as well. So just want to be clear about that. I do share a lot about my healing journey, my work through my poetry. Poetry is one of my favorite forms of art, and you can check out some of my poetry on my website. But I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Bonjour, Digigans ba P Indigenous Kaz, Aji Jaktodam, Trikodong, Minoa Mashki ZB Indojaba, Namanitagon and Dao. I said my name is the Laughing Otter. I'm Crane Clan. I come from the Keweenaw Bay Indian community and the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. and I live in the land beneath the trees, otherwise known as Manistee, Michigan. So if you see my background here, it's Lake Michigan, and I live right next to the lake, which is awesome. Like Deirdre, I am a multiracial individual, and on my father's side, I'm Ojibwe Métis, and our Métis connection is the island, Moaning Wanakaning, which is Madeline Island, Wisconsin, and it's considered the origin story of the Ojibwe. There's Lapointe, the town of Lapointe. So my family has heritage and connection to the island. In the United States, there is, with racial classifications that have been put on us, there is a lack of representation of Métis in the Great Lakes, specifically in Michigan. We do have a lot of our islands here in Michigan. There are Métis communities from Mackinac Island to Drummond Island to Madeline Island. So, and you know, it's been a reclaiming process for myself throughout my life. On my mother's side, she's mostly Scandinavian. And the reason I put the Sami information in the chat about the TRC work there, Truth and Reconciliation Commission work, is because we have done some research, and it's kind of something we're looking into, just kind of reclaiming that aspect of my identity as well. So as a multiracial individual and someone who has been committed to my healing journey my whole life, it's connected to the work I do. Also, it hasn't always been an easy journey. And, you know, I think it's important to understand that, you know, to support the work because it's ongoing. I do have my small businesses, Red Circle Consulting and Wab Ajijak Press. And Wab Ajijak Press is a small press that we publish bilingual children's books, mostly in Ojibwe. We have a new one coming out in Menominee, so I'm really excited about that. And it's kind of taken a back burner with the growth of the coalition, but that's okay. It'll come back around. In my consulting business, I do presentations, workshops, and other community engagement work. So I really enjoy what I do. I stay busy around the clock. And so, you know, getting to the work hasn't been, you know, a path that the red carpet was rolled out for me. And that's the result of my identities and oppression. I also identify as Two-Spirit based in my Ojibwe culture from an old school and decolonial framework. I think I'm going to take my glasses off because it'll be better without the glare from the camera. But you know, there's a lot of things that you endure as an Indigenous person. And, you know, I grew up in a suburb of Detroit. We'd always go to Keweenaw Indian community every summer. So I always had the cultural connection, but then I'd go back to the suburbs. So often it was very much so night and day, but not necessarily always the case with generational trauma. You know, there's a thing in the United States with homogenization tactics and wanting to assimilate us, and regardless of our blood quantum or community connection, it's not what it's about. It is about the community connection, and it is about who you are in your spirit, in your story. So I was raised in a really great community, a very liberal suburb of Detroit. I'll just say it. It was Royal Oak. Many of you may know it. Grew up in the 80s and 90s, and it was a great time. I was really raised in a village. So the things I've endured in my life, you know, the discrimination, the racism, the way society wants to hold you back, and even the community I live in now is a very racist community. So it is not necessarily easy even to be myself where I live. But I look at a place like my hometown and the people that kind of nurtured my dreams, from my neighbors, my friends, my teachers. And honestly, I wish I could say thank you to all of them today, because they got through difficult things. You know, they helped me to get through very difficult things. And, you know, it takes a lot of energy to heal. It takes a lot of courage. And, you know, even as I'm getting ready for our third annual Anishinaabe Racial Justice Conference in the Keweenaw Indian community this weekend, I'm thinking about really important things like family and healing, and what it's like to not know a grandparent because of generational trauma, because of racial disparities, because of systemic oppression. And talking with my mom last night on the phone about we're going to go to the cemetery, and we always do. And we always bring coins to make phone calls to what we would consider our heaven and where our ancestors are. So these are important things. You can be so in the work and so in production, so in the mode of, having to move things forward. And there needs to be a time for healing. There needs to be a time for you. So I think it's so important in this work, when we're doing the work in our communities, is to allow that space. And everyone has a different path. Everyone has a different, place they're in. And for some, they're just beginning, and that's okay. I think it's such an amazing time we live in to have people talk about generational trauma. And even last night when I was on the phone with my mother, it is across all people, really, but it is important to really understand what we have endured as Native people. I think if you look at the root cause of anything, you can see what is it. All people have trauma as a result of things that have existed, but we need that for us. We need this for us, and we need to have truth and reconciliation commissions. We need to have healing stories. We need to have events like the Anishinaabe Racial Justice Conference. We need to be able to be who we are, because we go out the front door and we deal with racism in our own communities. We go out the front door, we're not going to get a job because we're Native. We go into a workplace and we're going to deal with racism. These are things I've experienced. Erasure, invisibility is the real thing. And so again, I go back to the people who nurtured my dreams, and they get me through some really difficult times in my life. Being a leader, being a director, being a business owner, it's not easy, but I go forward because I always think of the ancestors. I think of my family, and some of my biggest cheerleaders in my life are some of the most amazing people. And some of the cheerleaders that have been in my life that are not with me now in the physical form are with me because I carry them in my heart. And I had tragically lost a friend earlier this year, and a lot of my friends, because I'm I'm a Gen Xer by a hair, and a lot of my friends are boomers. So she was 72 and she had so much wisdom. She was non-Native, but she basically, helped part of our healing journey. She would, say, what about this? What about that in your family? And I just want to respect everyone's boundaries. What about this person? And I would say, this is healing, is really honoring where someone has been as the result of generational trauma, as a result of federal policy to get rid of us as Indigenous people. And so when you live through that and you hear things, because as a boarding school descendant, my grandfather attended Holy Name in Assinins, which is in the Keweenaw Indian community. Or it's Assinins or Baraga, if you look it up. But we don't know what happened because my grandfather passed away in 1986. And so I wasn't able to get to know him. And a lot of this is the result of the boarding school policy. It is the genocidal policy. The reason why Native American men have the worst health out of all groups of men in the United States is because of this. And so often when it comes to this work, and as a Two-Spirit, I look at the whole of the community. What is a way to restore our nations? If, and I focus specifically on the Anishinaabe Nation, because it's, my nation. What does it mean? What does it mean to heal when you're healing so many things that maybe you don't know about yet? Again, growing up in a very liberal community, I had a gay bookstore 2 blocks from my house. I saw pride parades going down the street. I was allowed to be myself, but that's not the case for a lot of our community members. And it's not the case if you have trauma and you are shamed for who you are, your Native identity, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your spiritual identity, you have to hide it. And so hiding it brings shame. Shame becomes internalized. Hate, it becomes internalized as things such as perhaps an eating disorder or an addiction. And that is not your fault. It is never anyone's fault, you know. There are a lack of resources, racist resources, psychological resources. The colonial psychological models are often failing us. They fail us. I've dealt with racism in psychology, and I will never go back, because I believe the greatest healing comes from within the community. It comes from the land, just like Deirdre said. It comes from these trees, this water, the friends, as I call them, because there's many of them out there, and they don't all have two legs. So they have wings, and they have webbed foots, and they have, you know, scales and shells, and they're awesome and they're amazing. But the community is the higher power. This is one of my relatives in the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. He says this in his recovery journey. And I take it to heart, because it was the community that really brought me back. And I've always been connected to my culture. And there were certain times when I wasn't. And it's not the fault of the culture. It is the fault of colonialism. It is the fault of assimilation. It's not the fault of people who saw me or wanted to, you know, bring me to the, you know, my full potential in life. There is a lot we will face. There's a lot I will continue to face. I usually deal with it head on and address it and grab the bull by the horns. And even in the past month and a half, I've had to call out racism at the post office, racism by a contractor coming to do an estimate for a new hot water heater in my home, racism just going out in public because people don't want to make space for Indigenous people. Even where I live, it's on the reservation. It's not my reservation, but it is a reservation in Michigan. So what is it like for us? You know, what is it like to move things forward? Why is Truth and Reconciliation Commission work important? It's important for numerous reasons. We need this healing. And again, for us. And in a cultural view, Anishinaabe worldview, many of us are about the systems change that benefits everyone. It is important to have, again, the healing within the community. We are looking at origins of, you know, what is the root cause of this? What is the root cause that has created so much trauma in the world, really? But, you know, I can look back on my healing work that I've done within myself personally. And 20 years ago, I was 20, turning 21, and I was in the middle. I had an eating disorder as the result of generational trauma. I was a collegiate athlete, and I had to quit because of generational trauma. And again, thank goodness to all the amazing people who wanted to have these nets of prevention, because they give you an at-risk label, but it's not us that's at risk. It's society. It's the majority culture. I do not like to use the word dominant culture rather than, sorry, one moment. I'm in my home office and there's my cat approaching. So 1 second. Yeah. So she wants to be in the presentation. But yes, all these things of what brings us back into this work, and you're on a path. Yes, cats are healing friends all the time. My cat is Bijou, and Bijou is always in a healing mode. Well, so this, you know, you can look back, and I'm just kind of giving an example of, I didn't know that was going to happen to me, but it was almost inevitable that something like that was going to happen. And, you know, not to say that someone could stop that, because the cultural framework growing up in a big city was not there. And it's not to say that it didn't exist in my family. I'm saying it didn't exist in the majority culture. I think where I grew up in the metropolitan Detroit area, the lack of community resources there, it's a little different. It's changed now. Things have gotten a lot better. But at the time, I wasn't linked into anything. I was linked in to the North, and that's where we would go. So you look at healing on a personal level, and you may not understand things. Why are you doing certain things? You can look back on it in retrospect, and it makes sense because of generational trauma. And so being on this journey, it's amazing to see the way conversations can happen within the family circle, within the community. And so I look at, you know, I can think, oh, I'm in a certain path in my healing journey, but there's always room to grow. And as a leader, I believe in always growing. So grow through the work. I grow through healing stories. I grow through the conference. It wasn't fun to have the pandemic because there was a point where my spirit felt like it wasn't being filled. We weren't able to have a lot of events and things like that. We did some virtual outdoor things. And when things opened up, it was kind of like, wow, we have a lot to catch up on. But I think tying this into the boarding school healing and justice work, when I found out in May that my grandfather attended Holy Name in Assinins, it felt like a pile of bricks went right down my back. And actually, I live by myself and I'm very physically strong. I'm an endurance athlete. I'm a runner after healing, coming back from that. I'm a cyclist and a hiker and all that. So it felt such a weight that it almost was debilitating. But I think it wasn't physical pain, it was empathetic. So we can imagine when we have generational trauma and we don't know what happened because the relative is not with us, what happened to them. And what we can do if we don't know is to continue going forward for the community. Sometimes, the work is hard. It's like there can be something that this is not easy and you might want to give up. But I always remember, keep going forward. Don't let anybody stop you. Keep going forward for the community. And that's where I kind of link in with what my relative says, is the community is the higher power. We at the Native Justice Coalition recently launched a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Michigan. And when the information came out about Kamloops, that was another thing that I had felt. It really was an incredible burden. I think, as an intuitive leader, there's a lot to intuit in this work. Sometimes, again, it is overwhelming, but what can you do as an organization? Well, we want to do this work and we want to do something different. We just don't want to have a commission that is capped out after 2 years, 3 years. We would like it to run for at least 10 years. And we have different objectives. We have some, systems change approach that links into education, healing, of course, culturally specific, culturally relevant services, and also what Deirdre mentioned, those records, because many of those records are under lock and key. And that's a justice issue in itself. It's a strange thing, the way colonialism still operates in so many levels, but all of us are doing such amazing work. Sometimes I feel, in the beginning, as you're building a startup nonprofit, you're like, it's 11 o'clock at night, I should probably get some sleep. But, it's thinking about this work needs to be done. And I'm going to, really push to make it happen. And being in the place where I'm at, it's like, this is what I can do. And I'll keep going forward. The commission work, we have a working group, we have a boarding school survivor-led advisory council. It was just launched in June, so it's very new. And right now we're kind of in a building phase across the state. It's really exciting because we had the Road to Healing event with the Department of Interior in August, and we had 800 people attend with about 3 weeks notice from the Department of Interior. So to go there and to be there, we know the Michigan Native community is ready. Give a little background on the Healing Stories work. We had launched that program in 2018, and the Native Justice Coalition has been around for 5 years. And at that time, I was working as a consultant part-time and then building the coalition part-time. So I was only full-time as the director of the Native Justice Coalition since 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. And it was great to make the transition, but the Healing Stories program has also been a success. We also had to postpone the events we were going to have during the pandemic. And we're, kind of talking with some communities right now about 2023 events, because we're looking at a different approach, and that it's not a rushed process because it is such a difficult process. And we're just making sure, to kind of, build relationships that are ongoing and not, okay, we're here this year, we'll see you in 5 years later. It takes a lot of work in building this work into our communities. So every community is in a different place too. And some communities have a lot of boarding school survivors and descendants. And so there's that level of consideration when it comes to moving things ahead. I guess I'll talk a little bit more about the TRC work and then the work ahead. So we want to keep the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work, led by and for our people and communities. Often it's something that the government does, like Finland or the state of Maine, or other South Africa. There's basically these things that take place, but then is capped out. And so we want to make sure, because, well, what we've endured as Indigenous people didn't happen overnight, that we can at least have 10 years. With the state of Michigan, we will be in conversation, and we've already had some really great conversations with different elected officials on this process. We want them to be a part of it. They're not leading it. We are. So we just hope for a great election, because we have a governor that would be definitely very supportive of this work, Gretchen Whitmer. So we are, moving things forward, and we will see this weekend what happens at our conference with the connections. I'm really excited about it. I've been waiting for the conference after postponing since the pandemic, and it's really great to be in a safe and supportive space, and a place that is my home as well. So just like Deirdre said, that the land and the water, I would try to, speaking of generational trauma, I try to move out of the Great Lakes and Anishinaabe Nation in my 20s, and it didn't work. The lakes always brought me home, and I always dream about the lakes when I was in grad school in Colorado. And I'd always dream about these tall trees, and I was like, I guess that's the Manistee National Forest and the beautiful trees. And as soon as you get north in a certain line in Michigan, it's about 10, you get north of 10, and it's stunning. The trees are so tall, so amazing. And it'd be nice to see what the trees were like before colonization. How tall were the trees? Where were our trails? A lot of our trails still exist. If you look at 94, I-75, those are all our trails. So I know you all are, many of you are in Illinois, so maybe some of these roads. But I love it here, and I love the community. I don't want to be anywhere else in the world. I don't like to travel that far out. I've had presentations in Kentucky and stuff, and I'm always at different universities there in the past, or New York or Iowa, and I'm always happy to come home. I love it here. You can even feel the difference in the watershed as soon as you get out of the Great Lakes watershed. So it's heavenly, and I'm working to restore, and heal and be a part of this work, and the amazing things that can happen when we come together as a community. And I think it's just important to support the work, mobilize, and kind of build on that. But yeah, so that's the work ahead, and that's a little bit about who I am and the Native Justice Coalition and our Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Thank you so much, Cecilia.
Yes.
All your strength and your leadership and your emotion and your just sharing yourself with everybody today. And we'll I think at this point move to our third and final panelist, Kayla Johnston, who comes to us from the Canadian National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. And then after Kayla, we will have questions and answers. Thank you, Kayla.
It looks like my connection has stabilized. I seem to be coming in real time, which is good. Just as a note, if my Wi-Fi falls or if I start to sound garbled, I'm going to patch in via phone. Some of the trials and tribulations when doing presentations during travel. So I'm going to share my screen. And it's hard to tell on this system, but does everyone's screen goes full with the orange image here of my title slide? It's not minimized. It looks pretty nice and big. Perfect. Okay. And I just moved a window in front of it. Did that block your view? Wonderful. Thanks so much for your patience as I figure this out. Usually I'm working on 2 screens. And this time I'm working on a single screen. So I'm juggling a few. But with that, before I get into my presentation proper, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am, where I come from, just to add to what was already shared about that information. But in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about looking at apologies stemming from the 1980s onwards, and looking specifically at the Prime Minister of Canada's apology, looking at the Rcmp's apology, the Anglican Church, as well as most recently Pope Francis's apology. I'll also be talking a little bit about what the purpose is related to reconciliation, some challenges and alternative views, and steps for moving ahead. But with that, a little background information. So I'm an intergenerational survivor from the Canadian residential school system. And these are just a few of the schools that my extended family had attended. There's the Maryvale School on Coasis, where they mentioned last year, locating about 751 unmarked graves of a community cemetery abutting next to the residential school cemetery. Then there's the Round Lake Residential School, also in what's known as the Capel Valley area in Saskatchewan. You can see down below is the Capel Industrial School. And then finally from Alberta, the Crowfoot School. And so I had my mother, her siblings, my maternal grandparents and extended family attend through these schools. In fact, my great-grandfather is one of the first students who attended the Capel School and is reported in Indian Affairs. Now, in addition to being an intergenerational survivor, I worked for the Truth Commission of Canada, gathering statements from survivors, families, and others who wish to share a little bit about that experience with the commission. And so with that, we had a collection of over 158 staff listed in the statement gathering personnel, but the team you see on screen is the core team in the end that went through. I was one of the first 25 statement gatherers trained. I like to joke and say I was part of the guinea pig group, but out of those 25, there were only 2 of us who made it through the entire journey, myself and another survivor actually named Barb Cameron. Now, I'm connected to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And so we're the permanent home for all of the statements, documents, materials collected by the Truth Commission of Canada. And we're here to serve survivors, their families, to have access to that history, here for educators so they can dive deeper into share this history with the students in their class, for researchers to dive deeper into the mysteries that exist. And then the last 2, the history and the public, are so closely intertwined. We're here to ensure we can help foster healing and reconciliation with the materials in our collection. Now, this leads me to the bulk of this presentation, which is related to apologies. In fact, there have been at least 19 different apologies given from religious institutions, government, both federal and provincial, as well as educational institutions. But one question we'd like to ask is, what about other bodies that no longer exist? Or apologies for colonial systems like the 60 Scoop? There were premiers throughout 3 provinces that gave an apology. We're also wanting to know about day schools, sanatoriums, as well as Indian hospitals, and the potential to have apologies given for those colonial systems. Now, the first one I just wanted to highlight is number 1 from 1986, the United Church. It was the first apology given by a church, and it was spurred on by an Indigenous activist named Alberta Billy, who approached the United Church in 1981, demanding that they apologize. So this first apology was not actually about residential schools. It was about the violent nature of missionary work. So in 1986, the Right Reverend Bob Smith apologized on behalf of the United Church for the part it played in colonization. Now, just 2 years later, in 1988, the Indigenous Church acknowledged that apology, expressing its hope that the church would actually live within the words. And that's one piece that you'll see a common theme is the support that's needed beyond the apology. Now, one of the common questions we get is, what is reconciliation? And throughout our first 2 presenters, you may have gleaned a little bit of what reconciliation can mean. And the fact is, it's a subjective concept. So depending who you ask, you're going to get a different definition. So the Truth Commission defined it as an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. So we've asked a number of groups, what does that mean? What is a respectful relationship? And really what it boiled down to is everyone having the right to feel safe, to be treated with fairness, to be valued and feel accepted for who they are. Now, a critical part to reconciliation is repairing damaged trust. And to do so, the Truth Commission identified three pathways of doing so. One of them being making an apology. Another is collective and individual reparations. And the last one, this is one that has my little animation here, is following through with actions that demonstrate real, clear societal change. So we see this in the perspective as an apology is critical in building that trust, but there are other components to advancing reconciliation that come outside of an apology, like reparations, like truth commissions and gathering statements. And these are very useful in finding identity, answering the questions of who am I, where do I come from, which can then also be used to educate. Now, what I wanted to share a little bit more when it came to what is reconciliation was part of it. In 2019, the Canadian Youth Reconciliation Barometer was released based upon surveys with Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. And one question they asked is, well, what's reconciliation mean to you? And so there were a number of themes that you can read off my slide here that stood out, but the top 3 were rebuilding a relationship and rebuilding trust. That included terms like getting along, rebuilding trust, respect, and working together. The next you see here, number 2, is apologies and making amends. So that was described as acknowledging past wrongs, forgiveness, as well as making things better. And the last one, the third top theme, was repairing and correcting the past. And you can see it also included such ideas as correcting the past and making things better. Now, as I mentioned, because reconciliation is so subjective, depending on the relationship level, it can look a little different. So for instance, at the individual or family level, reconciliation can look like an intergenerational survivor relearning their family history, their connection to community and culture. But it could also be a settler or non-Indigenous person, say, taking the University of Alberta's Indigenous Canada course or other education courses about Indigenous peoples or communities and history. At the meso level, that's our communities and neighborhoods and workplaces, reconciliation can include public sharing circle space, intercultural gatherings, or say the development of a territorial acknowledgement. The last one here is the macro level, and this is where often we're focusing a lot of our attention. It's changes to our legal, education, healthcare system, or the economy. And that can look like anything from implementing the calls to action or the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so you can see, depending on these different levels, we can get a different perspective of what is reconciliation. And that's really great as communities and individuals can build a definition that works for them, which could or could not include the apologies. And so I'm now going to move into a quick look at some apologies. The first one being that I'm going to highlight is from 1991 in the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. So in March of 1991, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops released a statement that they had listened to, heard, and experienced some of the stories and materials of survivors of the Catholic residential schools. And within that statement, they made an apology and expressed regret for the pain, for the suffering, as well as the alienation caused by these schools. And so with that, they actually made a pledge. And this pledge included a pledge of solidarity for and with Indigenous peoples to pursue basic human rights, to respect the dignity and value that cultures and spiritualities had or have, to support Indigenous people pressing governments to respond to their needs, and to have the government assume the responsibility for their role in the residential school system. Now, just due to time, I'm going to keep marching ahead and talk a little bit about the Anglican Church apology. So in 1993, then Primate Archbishop Michael Piers gave an apology on behalf of the Anglican Church, stating that the church had failed in the creation of residential schools, that they had failed Indigenous peoples, failed themselves, and failed God. And so they apologized for their involvement in the residential school system, for the fact that it stripped the identity of Indigenous peoples, replaced it with their own identities, and for the abuses those students suffered. In 2019, Archbishop Fred Hiltz offered an apology at the Anglican General Synod for the spiritual harm caused by the Anglican Church. And so in that one, he confessed that the Anglican Church staff held cultural and spiritual arrogance towards Indigenous peoples. He confessed again that they failed to acknowledge Indigenous peoples had a connection to the Creator as well as to the land, that they demonized Indigenous practices and cultural pieces, that it dismissed Indigenous spirituality, that it suppressed again, cultural practices, and that it took away the children and forbade them from learning that history. Now, with that, and I think in a little, a little later on, I'm going to touch upon the Anglican Church's response in my next slide here. As the question is, to forgive or not to forgive. And so there's a wide range of responses from communities on how they've actually perceived apologies. There are some survivors who have expressed an acceptance and appreciation, much like Andrew Carrier, a Métis leader from Manitoba. And he said, hearing, say, for instance, the Pope's apology in person meant a lot to him, both as a survivor, but also as a practicing Catholic. He said that the apology brought up a number of tough emotions about his own experience, but also about his father's experience. Now, on the other hand, we've also heard from survivors who've outright rejected the apology. We know of some survivors, one I'm quite close with, who stated that they did not want to go and hear the Pope's apology because of all the harm that had been caused by the Catholic Church, and they were no longer willing to let the church back in their lives, or at least at this time. Now, interestingly enough, the Anglican Indigenous Elders Council in 2009 released a statement from that 2019 apology about the spiritual harm. And what they said is that they hoped that the apology could provide survivors with comfort, as well as the fact that they couldn't speak for all survivors. It was up to each and every Indigenous person to consider these apologies and decide for themselves whether or not they would accept that apology. And I really like this statement from one of the elders named Grace Delaney. And she said, each nation can now be true to the way that the Creator or God intended them to be. They don't have to choose between their faith and their culture. And I think when it comes to the purpose of apologies and what it can do is it can actually open that door for those individuals who may still be practicing their faith and may have had an internal conflict whether or not to engage in Indigenous spiritual or cultural practices. But with the apologies, they are able to walk hand in hand with their faith, as well as that history and culture of their communities. Now, I know I'm running out of time quite quickly, so I'm going to keep moving ahead, touching upon the RCMP's apology. And so there are actually two apologies given, one in 2004 by the former commissioner who apologized for the RCMP's involvement in the residential school system. And in it, Giuliano had said, to those of you who have suffered tragedies like residential schools, we, as in the RCMP, are very sorry for that experience, and Canadians can never forget what happened, and they shouldn't. The RCMP stated that they were optimistic about how they can work together and learn from each other when it came to that residential school system. And I just saw John put in the chat here for those that are wondering, RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so in a second apology in 2014 was given at the Edmonton National Event for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was given by then Commissioner Bob Paulson. And he said, I'm here today on behalf of the RCMP and behalf of the men and women who comprise this part to say that they're deeply sorry for what happened and for the part that the Royal Commission, the part that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police played when it came to the abduction, or I should say the forced involvement of getting those children and placing them in the schools. Now, much like the churches, which have been involved in a number of healing funds and raising of funds, the RCMP has been working on using trauma-informed approaches to developing reconciliation strategies, updating their RCMP training for new recruits, having a new Indigenous-led experience advisory group, as well as implementing tools for collecting race-based information on interactions that the police have with Indigenous and racialized peoples. And so they are slowly working towards addressing reconciliation, but much like the calls to action, which I'll touch upon in just the next two slides, we see that it's really not enough and not fast enough. So in 2008, the Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave an apology on behalf of the Canadian federal government, acknowledging the harms and damages caused by the residential school system to former students, but also the intergenerational damage that was caused to families and communities. Now, interestingly enough, a year later, the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, was quoted as saying, "We don't have a history of colonization or colonialism in Canada. We have all the great things that many people admire, great powers, but none of the things that threaten or bother them." Now, of course, the irony of that statement made on that international stage is for the fact that the Prime Minister had negotiated the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and had delivered that apology on behalf of the government for residential schools. So this highlights that deep lack of understanding of individuals, even in our own country, as to the colonial history and the connection to contemporary realities, which leads us to the calls to action. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released 94 calls to action in 22 thematic groups. And I'll say there are conflicting numbers as to how many calls to action have been completed. So the chart you see here are the number of calls to action that have been stalled or not started to date. And we do see that there is a general pattern where that number is slowly reducing. But Ian Mosby here stated that if we continue on the current path that we're in, it's going to take decades for us to address all 94 calls to action. And depending who you go to, you're going to get a different number as to how many calls have been completed. So in fact, I use all 4 of these sites to help guide me: the Yellowhead Institute, CBC Beyond 94, and Indigenous Watchdog, and the Government of Canada's website. So with that, I'd say we're anywhere from 11 to 13 calls to action completed. But largely, these have been symbolic calls to action, and we have to question how genuine are the efforts being made to address the calls to action. So the Yellowhead Institute had actually released a number of observations and concerns when it came to the calls to action. And in general, they said, not every call to action requires these lasting permanent changes to address the relationship. And so a lot of these low-hanging fruit ones are, say, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, the creation of an Indigenous Languages Commission, the amendment to the Citizenship Oath. Those were all calls to action completed in a single year right after the unmarked burials were discovered at the Kamloops Residential School. But the other observation they identified is for the fact that these calls to action are now being treated as a list or a tally sheet, where the more we're able to check off, the closer we can say that we've achieved reconciliation. But if we think back to the Truth Commission's definition, that requires, as I had said, an ongoing relationship, an ongoing effort or commitment to continue to follow through with these actions. And that's the biggest piece when it comes to some of these apologies. Now, just as a quick lead up to the apology given by the Pope in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI met with a delegation, including Grand Chief Phil Fontaine, to talk about an apology for Catholic residential schools. And so at that time, Pope Benedict expressed his sorrow for the anguish that was caused by some members of the church. And he said he offered his sympathy and prayerful solidarity, but no official apology was given. Now I'm going to jump a few slides ahead here to jump to Pope Francis here. So in April of this past year, March and April, we had a delegation of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit individuals visit the Pope at the Vatican, make a number of stops, as well as speak with him on an ongoing basis. And it was on April 1st where he released an apology then stating that he felt shame, and he'd say it again, he felt shame and sorrow for the fact that the number of Catholic churches, or I should say the number of Catholic individuals involved, had created wounds and created abuses against those here in attending those schools. And he said he wanted to state with all his heart that he was very sorry. Now, jump ahead a couple of months, Pope Francis is making his reconciliation tour across Canada, visiting Mascouches, Montreal, as well as Iqaluit as the big main stops. And within that, during his first stop in Mascouches, he offered an apology for the evil of church personnel who worked in the schools and for the catastrophic effect the schools had on Indigenous families. So within that, just because of time, I'm looking to jump to some of the reactions that were had when it came to the Pope's apology. First, I wanted to show a very quick slideshow of the banner. You may have seen this in some of the videos. It is a banner listing all the children we could positively identify who died at residential schools across Canada. And this first set of slides were from our 2019 event. However, we brought this banner an updated version. And so during a small private visit, the Pope kissed the banner. He spent quite a lot of time with the banner, feeling very emotional about it. And afterwards, the banner was wrapped up and driven at an excess speed to make it to the arbor where it was unfurled, and we had survivors and other individuals walk it through. So that was just a very quick slideshow. In my last 60 seconds here, a couple other reactions. One you may have seen is CP Cole, also known as Trina Francis, sang an ancient ballad to actually rebuke the Pope. Originally, they misquoted it saying she was singing O Canada in Cree. In fact, she was singing a different song and spoke to the Pope directly saying, you know, I hereby serve the spoken law. We, the daughters of the Great Spirit and of our tribal sovereign members, cannot be coerced into any law, any treaty that is not the great law. And so she felt compelled to go up and sing the song and speak those words to the Pope. So you can actually go and watch that in. And I'm going to take this last 30 seconds here to address two more pieces. One being the controversy related to the headdress. So Chief Wilton Littlechild was one of the Truth Commissioners, one of the commissioners of the Truth Commission. And after the apology, he actually placed and gifted the Pope a headdress. However, this action has been criticized in a number of communities. So I wanted to just quickly share his response is that it wasn't about religion. It was about spirituality, and that our ways or traditions, our spiritual beliefs are okay, which is very strikingly similar to the response from the Indigenous Anglican Church to that 2019 apology. And he said, as to that backlash, one of the lessons he learned was never to criticize anyone's belief. He wanted to show and gift the Pope this headdress based upon his own personal experiences and based upon a committee from several different communities, local, regional, as well as national. And they all confirmed or supported his decision to provide the Pope with the headdress. But he understands when it comes to other people's perspectives that they may not have done the same. And again, it's not about criticizing whether or not this was a good decision based upon all people's, but based upon his own personal journey. And that's why I did that kind of opening look at what is reconciliation? How do apologies fit into that? Is that for him, this was his means of moving on through his healing journey. But as I said, it may not be the same for everyone. Now, with that, short on time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the main screen here as I'm told there are some number of questions to be answered.
Thank you so much, Kayla. This was amazing information, and thank you to all of our panelists. I knew when we created this that we would probably fall short on time because there's so much information. But thank you for allowing for a good 10 minutes or so of questions and answers. So we'll just get right to what we have in the chat box. And it looks like all of them or most of them are to all the speakers. So feel free to jump in if this is something you're inclined to. The first question, we'll just do it in this order here, is were there excavations done at Carlisle to discover possible unmarked graves? Does anybody have knowledge about Carlisle specifically?
I was trying to look through that as an organization. I don't believe there has been any, but I could be wrong. But as of now, of the information that I got, there hasn't been any excavations committed at Carlisle yet.
I mean, I know that, I don't know if it was mentioned explicitly in May of this past year, the Department of Interior, headed by Deb Haaland, the first Native Secretary of Interior, released a preliminary report on the government, the U.S. federal government related boarding schools, which is only a part of overall boarding schools, of course. So it's just the tip of the iceberg. And as you mentioned, there's still a lot of research that's going on. So maybe this is something that we'll obviously get more information of as more research is done. The second question, was there boarding schools in the Northeastern and Southeastern areas? I've seen schoolhouses on the William and Mary College campus in Williamsburg, Virginia. Anybody have knowledge about those regions of the U.S.?
If you go to our website, it does list different colleges. So can I share my screen or?
Sure.
Okay. Just to give you guys some information here. Here, where is it at? Then I lost. Oh, there it is. Whoops, that's not it. Here it is. Okay. So if you go to our website and then if you look on education, and then it'll list United States Indian boarding schools. And so we do have a map and it will be updated. And so you asked if there were any in Virginia. Was that the question?
Yes, specifically so, William and Mary, but.
Yeah, the only one that we have on listed is Hampton University. But we are still researching, and again, I believe the DOI came out with 408, but we found an additional 97 schools, and so we very well could have there may be some more we found in Virginia, but we're still doing that research.
Okay, thank you, Deirdre. The next question is a thank you to all speakers, such knowledge, bravery, and passion. 2 questions. Outside of Canada and the US, how have worldwide, quote, apologies to Indigenous groups helped or hindered traditional owners?
I was going silent on that as they're connected to the apology by the Pope. It actually references under call to action number 58, the apology that was given to some of the Irish people, but I'm trying to find the specific instance to tell you whether it was about the Magdalene laundries and the unmarked burials there for children, or if it was for another specific instance related to the Irish and the Catholic Church.
Hmm. While you're looking that up, maybe we can move on to another question by the same attendee. What is your position about land acknowledgement? And are they more bark than bite? That's an excellent question. Who would like to share your thoughts and opinions on this?
I can do that. Well, I think for one thing, it's great to have the visibility and at least the acknowledgement, because there's still people, particularly in the United States, that don't think Indigenous people exist. And so it's one step forward. It's not all the steps required. I think it is, it also can be a little vacuous, is like, where is this going when there's suffering? So I think it's important to kind of critique it, but also like it is one step, and that's how I see it, is it's one step forward rather than continuing to move backward. And we have so much hate out there and so much invisibility that it's like, okay, it's something that didn't exist 20 years ago, but what can come out of it if we keep moving it forward? So that's how I see it.
I think those, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, just adding upon that, up here in Canada, there's a Indigenous academic named Hayden King who wrote the land acknowledgement for Ryerson University. And the biggest piece, he said he greatly regretted doing that for the fact that it was just used as a boilerplate. And so groups and organizations simply took that and just replaced the names of communities with the ones local to them. And so he said that was kind of one of his biggest regrets. What we're really kind of focusing on now when it comes to land acknowledgements, territorial acknowledgements, is that personal aspect. So how do you specifically connect to the treaty land or unceded lands and to the communities, and being very open and honest and saying, if you don't have a connection, state, I don't have a connection, and this is part of my learning journey. And to use it as an ever evolving piece based upon, again, the relationships you have with the communities, those that you serve and those that are around you.
Thank you. I think those were the last questions that we had on the Q&A box, but I actually have one if the three of you don't mind answering each of you individually, maybe to wrap up our presentation. And it is just, in all three of your opinions, how would you recommend that, say, average non-native people do to pursue justice and to pursue healing? We've talked a lot about organizations and churches and governments, but what can average people such as attendees that are non-native do to be good allies and to support and to help heal and to help pursue justice? Not an easy question, of course.
I have a whole list, but I wanted to give my two other speakers that opportunity if they had anything, because right now it's Truth and Reconciliation Week up here in Canada, with it ending on September 30th, or the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And things we advise when it comes to being an ally or supporting the struggle is just learning more. Education awareness is a huge piece. Reading, watching, listening to credible news sources, participating in learning activities, online education and training courses, but also things like picking up a good movie. I love film. Film is a really great way to touch not only your minds, but your hearts. And just visiting some of the archives that are out there, seeing some of these documents, engaging with these materials, going into community, bringing in speakers, elders, knowledge keepers, buying Indigenous made products, sourcing from Indigenous suppliers. There's a whole great list. And really, it's just a Google search away. If you type in Native American or Indigenous literature, you're going to come up with lists much longer than what I can provide you. So a lot of it is just pulling some of those pieces, but any film documentary options. I put one in the chat coming home from Carlisle about the repatriation of a few children back to their home communities from Carlisle, Pennsylvania school. You know, on Canadian Netflix, there's Indian Horse, which is a good one depicting sports. And really, it's exactly as what was experienced as depicted on screen for Indigenous sports players. Thinking of other quick ones, there's a great one from Australia actually called After the Apology, taking a look at the child welfare crisis. And if you look at Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, we're all facing the exact same situation of more children in care than there were children in boarding schools. We're up into that 10,000, 16,000, and a lot of it is that the cycle of violence that was set down by these colonial systems. But I'm talking too much, and I would like to see if my two co-presenters have any thoughts and suggestions.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you nailed it on the head. So I appreciate that. One thing I just, for me, what I try to emphasize to everyone that I speak to is that genocide happened here. And I feel that, you know, when for me, when I grew up in school, I learned about the Holocaust. I didn't learn about the Holocaust that happened here, the genocide that occurred on United States soil. And I was made to feel that Indian people didn't exist anymore. But here I was in the classroom. I was existing and living, and my family was living and existing. And so I just leave you with that. It did happen. Genocide occurred here. And any more research, any more information, especially with what Kayla already mentioned, I feel like that will, you know, put you on your path to the truth and understanding.
Yes, and to add on to that, sometimes there's things that can happen, like some things I've observed lately in the work is when I say, oh, I've dealt with racism, or I'm sharing something really painful. You know, it's important not to minimize it and say, oh, well, racism is everywhere. Well, we know that, but when you deal with it, it minimizes your day-to-day life, you know, or you have trauma as a result of the genocidal policies, and you're afraid to utilize a service like seeing a doctor regularly, you know, helping a friend overcome that. Like I had to get blood work finally after a decade of not getting blood work, and because I didn't have health insurance, and thank you to the United States for being so progressive. We're not. And, you know, I was like, I asked my friend, I was like, can you join me when it's a basic health thing to know your blood work. And it's like, even that, those simple things. There's another thing I think that's important is, you know, in the United States, we have it's very different in Canada because Native Justice Coalition, it's based in Anishinaabe Nation. So we interface with our communities in Ontario and Manitoba as well. And that's where we're growing. And I know there's going to be a lot of other connections, but there's different ways of understanding identity. And I think it's important not to minimize identity. When someone says they're Indigenous, and they do not cut up someone's identity. I think it gets really like, you know, it's really painful. There's enough pain. And so we have this thing in the United States where often in racial justice, we pick like, you have to be one thing, or, you know, it's like, that's when I had a conversation years ago with my mother and I was like, yeah, I'm biracial. All my life, I thought I was biracial. And I was like, wait, she's like, no, you're multiracial. And that's what Métis identity is in terms of, you know, in the Great Lakes, it's a unique identity, and it's specific to, you know, one of the things it's specific to is the fur trade and that relationship. But anyways, I think that's important. Move beyond the discussions of, you know, what is kind of mainstream liberalism and neoliberalism around racial justice. You know, think about the work that's needed in our communities, from, you know, our Indigenous communities in Florida to Arkansas to Michigan and up to, you know, the Northwest Territories. So let's think about that, because it's wherever Indigenous people are everywhere and we're resilient. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you all so very much. Before I say my farewells, on behalf of all of us involved, in the chat box, I know that our hosts, is there a way that we could save some of these good recommendations that are being posted here and maybe send it to all attendees in the email that's forthcoming? If that's possible, Joan or Kate, please let me know. So hopefully that'll be there, because there's some really good films and resources here to respond to that last question, or to what Kayla suggested as far as films. But other than that, again, I want to thank our presenters. Thank you for your time, your strength, your leadership, your knowledge, and most importantly, sharing your stories and your emotions. It's not easy to talk about these things, as you've said. We can only that are not native and have not experienced anything like the generational trauma you've talked about, listen and learn and empathize. And so thank you so much for everything you've put out for us today, for our knowledge and for our goals to move and learn and heal. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you to our library partners. Thank you to Joan and the College of DuPage Speakers Bureau. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and take care, and thank you so much again.